All right, thank you for tuning back in to part 3 of this series on the Forensic Masters List, the 25 most important vocab words in my opinion. All right, so this third part is going to be called Weapons, Prints, and Marks. The first one we focus more on just the basics, a broader terminology of forensics. Second subset, we kind of focused on biology and biological pieces of forensic evidence used. This one we're going to talk about some weaponry, some physical prints, stuff like that. So number 11 is going to be ballistics and ballistic evidence. So this would be the study of certain firearms, the study of ammunition and bullet trajectories. So that's kind of for me, that's kind of a fun one to study, because I find it interesting, and you can figure out different angles, certain details about how a crime might have happened from different details when ballistics is used to analyze a crime scene. I do want to give you another real-life example of this. It'd be the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, JFK, in 1963. This actually relied on ballistic analysis to trace bullet fragments back to Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. Now, I know this is a subject of conspiracy and debate on whether he was the actual person who did it or not, which I'm definitely open to conspiracy theories on that topic. But the type of evidence used still applies, ballistics, in terms of tracing it back to a certain gun, a certain perpetrator, and yeah, there's a lot to that that we'll dive in another video. But in a broader analysis, ballistics is definitely something that's important in forensic science. Okay, so next on to number 12 is going to be GSR, also known as gunshot residue. This is going to be defined as tiny particles left on shooter's hands, clothing, or nearby surfaces after firing a weapon. So as you can imagine, this helps identify shooters, perpetrators, the person behind the weapon. An example of this GSR testing would be how they helped convict Scott Peterson in 2004. That case is actually on Netflix, which I watched with my girlfriend recently. But in 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted when residue was found that linked him to firing a weapon during the timeline of his wife's disappearance. So that's pretty substantial, right? And yeah, just like a lot of what made me interested in forensic science was Forensic Files growing up, watching that, and man, ballistics and gunshot residue specifically was linked in a lot of those cases that helped solve crimes. All right, moving on. Number 15. This is going to be latent prints. So this is defined as fingerprints that, instead of, you see fingerprints that aren't visible to the naked eye. They're usually revealed with things such as powders, chemicals, or light, maybe even dyes. So you use certain compounds in the lab to reveal them. And getting these kind of prints is extremely valuable in investigations and crime scenes, as they could lead to arrests, to identifications, and ultimately convictions if they have the right guy or perpetrator. A real life example of this would be the 1994 Madrid train bombing investigation. and a misidentified latent print wrongfully implicated Brandon Mayfield, showing both the power and dangers of fingerprint analysis. I chose this example because it shows how forensics, even though you develop a technology, you need to constantly be checking that technology and improving it, and having it under scrutiny, so that you don't lead to wrongful convictions, because that's also a really big problem. Sometimes forensics, if it's deemed as science or reliable, it could lead to wrongful convictions if you're not careful. And I think that's a really important point. But a lot of times latent prints will lead to good convictions. It just has to be combined with good science and good lab testing and things like that. So I think that's an important note to highlight. Okay, a little bit different setting here, but moving on to number 14 on our list. And this one's going to be tool mark analysis. TOOL, tool mark analysis. So this is actually going to be examining marks left by tools on objects like crowbars, screwdrivers, knives, etc. So looking at the imprints made by specific tools. Believe it or not, this could help actually identify a lot of things and help investigators on crime scenes. A real life example of this would be in 1932, going a little far back, almost 100 years. In 1932, Lindbergh baby kidnapping, tool mark analysis on a homemade ladder, of all things, linked it to wood from Bruno Hauptmann's attic. So you could see how back then they kind of had to get really creative with their forensics and what they used to identify suspects. So they actually were able to identify specific wood used in that ladder. Apply that to today. There's tons of different tools that are used in crimes, unfortunately, and you'd be surprised the amount of imprints that are made. Sometimes the suspect realizes they're doing it, sometimes they don't, and that helps investigators quite a bit. All right, moving on to our last one on this list for part 3, and that's going to be impression evidence. This will be defined as any markings or patterns that are left by objects such as tires, shoes, or teeth. So we kind of already talked about teeth. That's odontology, but it kind of intersects here. It's just something that leaves an object that leaves an impression or pattern, specifically pattern. So a real life example of this would be a very well-known case. This was on Netflix as well as a lot of these true crime cases. The LA Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. He was tied to murders partly through a unique shoe print left at crime scenes. And if you guys remember this, they were actually able to identify the size, the imprint, and what store it was bought at. And dental impressions were actually part of it too, but because they pulled funding, they didn't want the cops waiting there too long. They didn't catch them at the dental office. They almost did. But long story short, the shoe imprint was made by a rare model, and that helped. I can't remember the name of the shoe at this point, but that helped identify Richard Ramirez and kind of led the investigators on the right track. All right, that sums up this part 3. Thank you for watching, and move on to part 4 if you want to learn more forensic concepts.